phase conjugate pentodeca grid. And we now know, and this is, again, conventional electromagnetics if we study it carefully, that this pine cone shape right here of waves, called phase conjugation, pine cone shape down a cone, is how you take the transverse wave and convert the transverse inertia down to the compressional wave called longitudinal electromagnetics, compressional waves. And longitudinal waves, sometimes incorrectly called scalar or torsional, are known and proven to be faster than light. How God makes phone calls, and now we see how gravity travels. So if phase conjugation causes gravity, suddenly now we can see how the Hodowanich and Ramsey, when they used capacitors to measure, stellar explosions much more efficiently than the LIDO experiments. If you just Google the Hodowanich, I'm typing in gravity detector, you get that whole story, that basically the ability to pick up gravity waves can be done with a 10-cent capacitor if you know what you're doing, because capacitive coupling for the superluminal longitudinal EMF is gravity waves. This doesn't require this very expensive gizmo, the LIDO, that just made headlines. So why are we going into this whole science story right here when we're talking about the brief history of God? Well, the plasma physics, the charge distribution efficiency that creates this grid, also creates areas in the universe which are more fertile to the possibility of self-awareness. Effectively, remember, we now know that not only is the interval of adenosine diphosphate, ATP, and the time of the Earth year and Venus year, and the actual wavelengths of the only two frequencies that cause photosynthesis, all of these wavelengths are exact integer exponents of golden ratio times Planck time. So our rotational environment here was more susceptible to conjugate embedding and therefore more fertile to the birth of self-awareness. Basically, a good place to plant a DNA seed and hope it would grow up to become centripetal enough to steer stars around. Real estate is location and location and location. And our location was conjugate embeddable. Therefore, we were attractive for planting DNA seeds. So the Earth grid is dodecaecosa. The time of the Venus and the Earth orbital are exactly golden ratio exponents times Planck time. And we know that Isis, or rather Osiris, is said to be returning into the orbit of Venus, and we know it's a pentagram. So these are all the definition of the possibility of a structure in which incarnation is even possible. In other words, to be able to incarnate in something simply means if the plasma can be embedded, which is to say embeddability, which is more than an introduction to Playboy magazine. It's a description of whether one little donut, yes, we do this for every class, we'll do this for ever, embedded.
Go home.
Embeddability is the golden ratio that allows little donuts to non-destructively inhabit bigger donuts, and how to get into and out of the mind of gods. And that embeddability is perfected, called phase conjugation, in the wave geometry of not just hydrogen and photosynthesis, but the geometry of the Earth-Venus orbits, which are very susceptible to then charge implosion. And therefore, DNA has a better chance of growing up, getting centripetal, imploding, and steering stars around with plasma, creating bliss experience and all the good stuff. So, the brief history of God here is about the physics of the fact that there is the possibility of a divine presence. So what our view of the history of God and religion is that we agree with the Andromedans, Alex Collier and others, who said that religion was pretty much obsolete on this planet 400 or 500 years ago. It served a temporary function to help instruct people in the science of the hygiene of the acquisition of charge or bliss, called grace or chi, orgo, and baraka. But basically, at the point at which science can instruct people in those hygiene, then religion becomes obsolete. In fact, religion becomes a problem because religion creates miracle and personality worship, which is simply war. And if you want to avoid war, you replace personality worship and miracle worship with science, in the same way that governments based on personality worship otherwise known as dictatorships, always decay, whereas governments that are based on pure principle have the possibility of sustainability. Well, the same thing is true of spiritual science. That if spiritual science is based on personality worship, it's ultimately childish crap, really. In fact, the names for personalities are names for plasma entities that become centripetal. And at a high level, and this is more esoteric, we learn that advanced plasma beings, their name and their shape and their surface are one. The Ankh is actually an interstellar plasma being of high principle. So it's actually about the shape of a plasma being that creates the idea of the names of God, for example. The names of God in Hebrew Kabbalah are the symmetry permutations of 3, which is actually the symmetry operations of wave mechanics. And you know how we got into that was because our friend John McGovern, who's pretty famous there in Australia, in Flinders Range, and he had found Hebrew letters and Ophanim Enochian letters there carved on the Adnyamatna cave walls in the Flinders Range on the north of the Bight in Australia. And studying the cave wall paint, the carvings, for example, eventually John McGovern claimed to believe that he could interpret any ancient petroglyph carving on the planet, basically based on a pure shamanic principle, that what the shamans were always seeing and